Hi, and welcome back to the No More Global Dialogue series. For those of you that joined us during No More Week in our Tech Summit, thank you so much. You can obviously see the full recording now live on YouTube and visit it whenever you feel ready to. But today's session, I'm super excited because we'll be digging into and exploring the impact of financial or sometimes known as economic abuse. And I think one of the things we really want to sort of explore is how financial abuse will impact your relationship or impact you from the early stages of dating, following all the way through to separation and post-separation. And, one of the things that we are learning more and more of those working in this space, providing support, is actually how profound the impact can be and how long-lasting it can be. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you one of the leading experts on economic abuse who's been doing this work for over 20 years is Dr. Nicola Sharp-Jeffs, whom has not only set up the charity in the UK called Surviving Economic Abuse, but is also working globally now on a consortium and collective who are all working across the globe to put in very clever and preventative measures and working alongside some of our most leading financial institutions, which we'll learn more about. And following that, I'm overwhelmed and joyous to introduce Hannah Grace Stender, who is the board chair for Speak Your Truth Today, which is an organization which provides a safe space on a social media platform, Facebook, for those who are enduring or experiencing domestic abuse, which is supported by those whom are either trained or part of the process of auditing it, and ensures and enables a really safe space for people to share their experiences. But in addition to that, Hannah is a business owner, an advocate, and a local volunteer. And I loved your way that you sort of introduced yourself at the last event that we were at, where you said it's your 23-year anniversary of freedom. And you've been sharing your experiences as a survivor since then. And, for all of us who have heard your experience, thank you so much. And for sort of a pre-thank you for everyone who will get the opportunity to hear from you today. So I know this is a pressing issue. And I think that when we often think about domestic abuse and how it can impact us, we often are told about it in the way of you're in the relationship, you are considering leaving, there's a point of post-separation, and then after that, there's a space where you are still enduring, stalking and harassing behavior and other forms of domestic abuse. One of the things that we've not done exceptionally well as an overall sector is really dig into some of those early warning signs and some of the things that we potentially see and have concerns and questions about, but perhaps don't know how to dig into. So we're hoping that by the end of this session that you will feel equipped enough to turn to a friend, family member, or colleague and ask questions if you fear that they're experiencing financial abuse. But most importantly, if someone does make that disclosure, you'll be able to refer them to that specialist support service. So Nicola, starting with you. We know financial abuse is a big sort of over, an umbrella term. And it's perhaps not easy to sort of put this in quite succinctly, but what would you say, from your experience, are some of the common forms of financial abuse, which can happen in the early stage of a relationship or even continue through to post-separation? Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you. It's a great opportunity to share more about this form of abuse, which I think is very under-recognised, but to your point is so key to a victim survivor leaving and being able to move forward with their life. But as you say, Lindsay, it is a form of coercive and controlling behaviour. And that means because it doesn't require physical proximity, you might have fled or gone somewhere where the ex doesn't know where you are, and yet they can still continue to control you financially. So it's really important to understand. In terms of what it looks like in practice, either at the beginning of a relationship, during or afterwards, usually there's kind of three different types of control. So the first might be restriction. So that's when somebody might be restricted from accessing a bank account, for example, or accessing money, or accessing information about financial products that might be in their name more broadly, or information about kind of the financial well-being of the household. So finances might be kept very secret. And that form of restriction usually leads to some kind of dependency. So it might mean if you can't access, a bank account, for example, you can't, buy a train ticket, to go and see a friend or family member, or you can't buy food when you need it. The other form of control that we see is exploitation. And this is probably less common, but well, sorry, probably less known, but I would say probably more common actually as women become financially more independent, because obviously restriction was easier when women didn't have their own means, for example, when they didn't go to work. And that's changed in the last couple of generations. But by exploitation, we basically mean sort of abusers kind of freeloading, or in my own language, refusing to contribute. So this might be, you know, someone who has their own job, but they refuse to contribute to the household. So the victim survivor is kind of left with all the bills. So, you know, that might be paying the mortgage or the rent on the property. They might be paying all the bills. They might be paying for the childcare. They might be, you know, paying for the food, etc. And that means that they very quickly run out of money themselves, and or they might have to get into debt in order to kind of meet the abuser's needs. And quite often in that scenario, we see the abuser demanding a certain kind of lifestyle. So they want the best of everything, you know, the best clothes, the best food, the best everything. So that could be really difficult. And I know victims and survivors who, as well as having to kind of get into debt in order to meet those needs, you know, have been working multiple jobs and are absolutely exhausted as well. So that doesn't create dependency, but it creates instability. So through restriction, you might not have £100 in your bank account to flee. But through the instability, you might just not have a free £100 similarly to flee, because you're so busy meeting all the bills and debt repayments. You don't have that disposable income. So whilst it looks slightly different, the impact is the same. And then we see sabotage, and this is another sort of way of draining the victim survivor's financial resources. So this might be, you know, destroying the television, destroying a mobile phone that needs to be replaced. We often see, as a form of exploitation, in addition to a victim survivor perhaps having to take out debt, actually being coerced into debt by the abuser, and they might be aware of that debt or they might not be aware of it. But the long and short of it is that if they're being exploited in that way and someone's taking out credit in their name, then that's likely to sabotage their credit rating as well. And again, that has huge implications moving forward. For example, you know, if they need to pass a credit check in order to access housing or to get a job in some spaces. So those are kind of the three different ways in which sort of financial abuse shows up.
Thank you so much for that. I love the way that you've been able to categorize it into sort of three distinctive different sort of sections, because actually you may identify as experiencing many of them, but actually having that as a clear route and sort of seeing how in some ways we can say and quite honestly say that those that choose to be abusive are choosing to go down that pathway. This is a choice that they're making to use these tools and resources to exert that power and control over you. Thank you so much for that. Hannah, sort of in a way, if you don't, how do you feel that this type of abuse is potentially different from the other forms of abuse that we are, you know, very well spoken about, we know very much, we are very aware of if somebody makes that disclosure?
Sure. So the really interesting thing about financial abuse is that it is so subtle and so behind the scenes. It is so unseen by anybody else. Excuse me. You're not going to hear, you know, an abuser commenting in public about something, or you're not going to see them physically harm somebody. And so it's something that happens behind closed doors, where it is so quiet and it sneaks up, and they can slowly and methodically take control of your financial life to the point where you do not have any resources to leave or any way to move. So it also has very different long-term effects. As a survivor, once you have left, you can go to therapies for everything you've been through, you can seek medical help, but the financial impact can stay with you for so long and can drastically impact the rest of your life. Personally, I've 23 years out, and I am finally able to get a loan for a car. I'm finally able to have a credit card. It was very exciting when I got a credit card. I'm 43 years old. I shouldn't have had to wait 23 years to get these things, but I had to file for bankruptcy at 22, just to get out of the debt that I was placed in. And I was unable to get my credit score to a point where I could continue living my life. And this impact was continuously dragging me down and continuously causing triggers. Anytime I tried to do anything with my life, I'm now triggered that this experience happened in my past. And so it shows up in very different ways, and it may prevent you from experiencing life, even functioning in life in a much different way.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing so much about
Yeah.
your own experience. I think it sort of falls in some ways back to that core question of how often and how comfortable do we as individuals feel about talking about money? And how do we broach those subjects with those closest to us? What are your thoughts on that, Nicola?
I talk about financial abuse being a double taboo, actually, because we don't talk about abuse as a society and we don't talk about money. So, when was the last time you sort of compared your salary, with your friends when you were, out for a drink in an evening? It's intensely private. And I think because of that, we don't talk about finances generally, but we also don't talk about how we would manage them. So whether or not something is controlled, we don't have many reference points, I guess. So as you say, I think it's so important that we, speak openly about these issues. And there are some great opportunities. Certainly, when I've spoken to employers in the past, you can find a hook for a conversation, potentially, if your employee is going on maternity leave, you can say, so, you'll be, on maternity pay. Have you had a think about how that will work in practice? Have you spoken to your partner? Do you have a plan? And that might be an opportunity to kind of start a conversation, which might lead you to recognize that something's wrong, and to kind of gently broach that. Or it might create a space for your employee to actually say to you, well, this is the situation I'm in. So creating those spaces, and something that an academic called Professor Liz Kelly talks about all the time, which I love, is creating that invitation to tell is just so important, because we know a lot of victim survivors just want someone to ask the question.
I love that. Liz Kelly, amazing. But I love that, the invitation to tell. And I think, part of this session is really about us digging into that space about how do we do that well, with compassion and empathy and without judgment, to those closest to us. I suppose, Hannah, I'd love to extend that question for you, because obviously we're sitting in the UK, we have different support systems that are available, through maternity leave, through other benefit systems. How would that type of question would have landed, do you think, in the US?
I think it's so tricky. And as Dr. Nicholas said, that it is so taboo that we don't really even discuss when people are having hard times trying to get onto maternity leave, which is something we struggle with here. And so to find those spaces where it's okay to talk about your finances is so tricky. I'm trying to think of a good place where that could be a conversation. And I think it would have to be in a setting where it's almost a friend to friend, where you're, say you're a friend and you're watching somebody try to pay for something and their card's getting declined and they don't know why. And they can't figure it out. And the friend can then broach, hey, let's talk about this. What's going on? Is there something we can do? Do you have access to this? Can we work out a situation? And from there, it allows them the safe space to have that conversation. But I think from the employer standpoint, I'm not sure that we're at a spot, especially in this area of the United States, where it would be a comfortable conversation. It would have to be an employer that was very close with their employee.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Before we move sort of on to the next couple of questions that I have for you both, can we just spend a minute and loop back to something that you said, Hannah, about how subtle financial abuse sort of creeps in to the relationship? And, let's really sort of unpick sort of what that looks like in those early stages. What is sort of your view, in a way, Nicola, of what those that you've worked with have said are some of those early behaviors that the abuser may choose? And then I'll extend the question to you, Hannah.
Yeah, I think it's quite often framed as caring behaviour. So it might be that someone says to you, you're so busy, why don't I manage the finances? It will be one less job for you. Or it might be something along the lines of, and it might start playing into kind of stereotypes within society. Oh, in a heterosexual relationship, for example, and in most societies, sort of men kind of hold the money anyway, and are generally thought to be better at finances. So it might be something along the lines of, well, actually, I'm better at managing the money than you. So, why don't you leave it to me? Or it can play into sort of stereotypes around motherhood. So again, you don't need to go back to work. I can provide for all of us. Wouldn't you rather stay at home with the children? Don't you think you'd be a better mum if you gave them all your time and didn't leave them, with a nanny? So, lots of ways to make it feel as if you're sort of being cared for, looked after, and that you're kind of doing the right thing. So it might not be until you realize that perhaps you're in a situation where you want to leave, that you suddenly realize, actually, I don't know how much money is in the joint bank account. I don't know whose name the car insurance is in. I don't have any information to know what my situation would look like if I did flee.
Really interesting. Sort of, what are your thoughts on that, Hannah?
So I completely agree. Personally, mine was a little different. My abuser started physically abusing me the second I ended up running away from home and moving in with him. And the emotional abuse followed quickly after. I turned 18 while I was in that situation. And in the States, that's when you start getting all of the credit card applications. And he filled out every single one of them and forced me physically to sign them, and then had me call and put him on as a joint card holder for every single one of them. And then he took my cards away and then racked up the debt. He would take us on a random trip to Florida and pay for Disney World and take us out to eat and buy a car. And he just spent and spent and spent. At the same time, I was not allowed to have a job. Our checking account was only in his name. And by the end, he was hiding our only wallet from me. So I had no access to even $1 of my own. But that's over 2 years of slowly working away. When we first started dating, he would just constantly ask me for money. Oh, can you give me $20? Oh, can you give me $10? Oh, I need a little bit of money for this. Oh, I need a little bit of money for that. And so I was already in this habit of handing things over to him and giving him money. And so that by the time all these things started happening, it was just second nature. Oh, he's the one who has all of those things. I don't need to worry about it. He's got it, until it reached the point where I had nothing.
Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it really does echo in that piece is that it is so subtle and done in such a way, like you say, Nicola, about it's done through caring behavior. It's framed in a way that it's going to help you and that it's going to make your life easier. And in many instances, it's those pieces around with that first stages of without me, you can't live. I am part of your future. I am your future. I become the center of your world, and this is how I achieve it. I suppose the other piece, before we sort of move on, is to say, in those moments, how do you think friends or family members would be viewing your relationship? And you were really brilliant at sort of bringing forward that moment of, if your friend is struggling to pay for something, you could perhaps jump in. But what do you think friends and family members were potentially observing?
I think it depends on whether or not they're seeing the whole picture and the environment they're in. So culturally, in my world, it is very common for the one who would be viewed as the abuser or the abused in the situation to have a job, to be financially independent. And so from the outside, it would look normative. And so to find out that they didn't have access to their bank account or didn't have access to a credit card or this was going on would be a red flag for friends and family. However, there are other parts of our culture and society where that is not a red flag. That is not something that is seen as a problem because it's just expected. And so I think that it really is, if you're in, this cultural situation where friends and family are used to seeing you dealing with your own money and then suddenly you're not, that's a pretty big red flag right there for someone to pay attention to.
Really interesting. Nicola, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just to add, I think it's really about you knowing the individual and what would be, or what was their behavior perhaps when they met someone who was abusing them. So another example might be, someone who works, loves their job, suddenly saying, actually, I'm giving it up, or I'm not going back after the kids. That could be a red flag as well.
Really interesting. And I suppose it all drills down to that sort of same piece about how freely are we talking about our economic independence amongst our friends and family members, and so that we're able then to have that point of reference to see a change is really great, is really interesting. Okay, slightly moving on to sort of digging into the sort of the psychological and emotional impact of it. We all know that finances at the best of times can be something that elevates us or can drag us down, and knowing that we're getting to March for our end of our financial year, we're all faced with fear about what in the UK what our council bill will jump to be, for example, and we know that it can change and impact our lives, but obviously that's in minor compared to the impact of long-term financial or even short-term financial abuse. But what do you think, for example, are some of the impacts of independence and self-worth on those who are enduring? Nicola.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question, because one of the reasons when I actually did the first piece of research around, I call it economic abuse, because it just recognises money and finance, which is the control of financial abuse, but everything also that money can buy. So it kind of extends into economic resources as well. And I do think it's really important that we recognise kind of all the behaviour of an abuser to kind of hold them accountable to it. But certainly one of the reasons that we haven't recognised financial or economic abuse is because for a long time people, certainly in the research community, actually treated it as emotional abuse, because a lot of it, as we've kind of already talked about, will impact kind of your self-worth, your self-confidence. And it also creates real fear. So again, I know victim survivors, who have struggle to meet their most basic needs. And if you think about kind of living in a situation day to day where you're terrified if you're going to have enough food for yourselves and your children, you're going to have enough heat to stay warm, whether or not you're going to be allowed to take a shower, all of these things really, create a fear of how you're going to survive, I guess. Which then obviously kind of impacts your confidence and your self-worth. And I'm always struck when I speak to victims and survivors how they talk about financial abuse and self-worth together, kind of using that word worth in different ways, like how much something's worth, and or how much you feel yourself worthy. So yeah, it's I wouldn't usually, I haven't, or have, I would think it was rare to see kind of financial abuse happening without emotional abuse alongside. Certainly it would be more sort of kind of the romance scam kind of end of the continuum, where someone's very deliberately out to take control of your finances, I guess. And I think also it can make you feel stupid. I think, again, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but you enter into a relationship with someone and you want to be able to trust them. Of course you do. You don't want to be questioning their motives behind offering caring behavior to you. That's not the way any of us would want to go into a relationship. And so I think, sometimes, to give your trust is not the wrong thing to do. And yeah, I think a lot of people feel really stupid that they did do that retrospectively. So I guess it's trying to find sort of a happy medium, where you can just kind of, I guess, be aware of the power of money, kind of test a few things out, I guess, to kind of work out whether or not, someone is seeking to control you in that way, or not. Perhaps as, something that we think about or talk about in the same way we might do, marriage plans or children plans or things like that, really. So yeah, I think the issues are so intertwined. It's hard to speak about, one and not the other.
No, I would agree with that. And I think it sort of falls into that space that we do live, many of us, and probably all of us would be fair to say that we live in a world where having money implies a lot of sort of self-worth and value. Not having access to money has a whole host of connotations to it, which you have to battle through at the same time as experiencing economic abuse, financial control. So sort of jumping to you, Hannah, in a way, what would you say are sort of the long-term effects on your mental health with regards to financial and economic abuse, sort of at the point of separation, and then how it can, you've been so open about how it's continued to follow you through your life?
Yeah, and I was just going to add to what I had said previously about the feeling of, excuse me, being a 23 years out and still suffering from the effects of that abuse. Um, Now, granted, we have come a long way in that time. When I left my abuser, we had where I am right now in the US, we had no form or even definition of what financial abuse was. There was no way to even categorize it. And something I've been thinking about while thinking about this topic is the fact that even today we don't a ton around it. And there is no way to get a financial institution to not go after a victim slash survivor of this sort of abuse when they're looking for their money. And so that's where a lot of the long-term effects can really wreak havoc on your entire life. As you said in my bio, I'm a business owner. I own a food diagnostics laboratory. We're very successful. We have a huge lab here in Vermont, and yet my name isn't on almost anything because we couldn't get a loan with my name on it. And that is, in a way, it belittles you even further because you now, after surviving this isolation and this lack of ability to be financially independent, now you can't even find that self-worth again to continue your life and start finding your inner strength, because every single time you turn around, you're reminded that you're not good enough because of what you went through. So for me, it's been a major issue. And I want to add to what Nicholas said. I have a partner now for the last 17 years. One of the first conversations we've had was, we will never have all shared money. Mm-hmm. We will always have our own personal bank accounts, and then we will have a joint account. And that way we can pay for things and we can put that money in if we choose to. But my partner, as much as I love him and trust him, will never have full access to my finances, and I will never have full access to his, to ensure that no matter what happens, life down the line, there is always that backup for myself. And that is something that I learned the hard way, is never put all your eggs in one basket.
It's really great advice about starting a relationship and having that open conversation, and how you can have those conversations if you feel safe to do so. And I think that becomes that testing point for yourself as well. If you feel unsafe and this conversation could escalate into something else, then there's obviously other stuff going on there, and sort of access and support around that. But you did mention something in what you said about, even if you were able to speak to that financial institution and gain someone's ear for them to have a level of empathy towards your experience, you didn't feel that anything would have changed. And I know for you, Nicola, like, I've watched in admiration the work that you've done alongside many of the UK and global institutions about changing that internally and through their policies and procedures. Please tell us a little about the work that you and your team have been doing over the past 20 years.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to what Hannah was saying about context, which is just so important. So in 2016, I did something called a Churchill Fellowship, which meant I could go and kind of look at best practice in different parts of the world. And I was like blown away by what was happening in Australia. And in many ways in the UK, we followed suit. So banks, financial institutions are really aware of this issue now, in a way, certainly, that they weren't in 2006 when I first started to have conversations with victims and survivors. Back then, if they moved into refuge accommodation, so shelter, the bank wouldn't accept their secret address, for example. They wouldn't remove one party from a joint bank account without the other party's consent. It was a real brick wall, actually. So thinking how far we've come is pretty incredible. That's not to say that we haven't got a long way to go, because we do. But two things have kind of really helped in the UK context. I think the first was that in 2017, our Prime Minister back then, Theresa May, wanted to launch landmark legislation around domestic abuse. And so I just founded the charity Surviving Economic Abuse at the time, and influenced government to both recognise economic abuse within the definition of domestic abuse within the Act and also define it. And that was hugely important because it kind of led to a whole, level of awareness that didn't really exist before. And it also gave victim survivors terminology, because of course they knew that control of money resources more broadly was wrong, but they didn't really have the words to go to the bank and tell them what was happening. There was kind of no way of kind of naming it. So I think that in and of itself was important. And then secondly, at the same time, from someone with a violence against women and girls background, I'm now very familiar with financial services kind of policy development, but we have something called the Customer Vulnerability Agenda, and that was happening at roughly the same time. So financial institutions started to recognise that some customers were kind of disadvantaged in terms of their access to financial products and their ability to use them. And they recognise different drivers of vulnerability, and they recognise relationship breakdown as a driver. And then again, through work with the charity back then, they recognise domestic abuse and economic control sitting within relationship breakdown as a driver to customer vulnerability. So that led to various different forms of guidance being developed, and banks and building societies being encouraged actually to support victims of domestic abuse. And in particular, in 2018, UK Finance, which is our membership body for banks in the UK, developed a voluntary code of conduct, which has now been signed up to by 29 banks, which covers 39 different brands. And basically, it's a set of principles which banks sign up to. So there's some level of consistency for victim survivors in the UK. So the really best practice, an example here would be Lloyds Banking Group, which is kind of the biggest financial provider of services in the UK. I think 1 in 4 of us have a product with Lloyds Banking Group. They have a specialist financial and domestic abuse team. So they actually have a team of around 30 specialists who exist to support customers who experience domestic abuse, which, was kind of always my dream when I set up the charity. So, I always laughed because they got a little bit bigger than the charity did, certainly by the time that I had moved into the international space. But, they do accept, refuge addresses now. They will remove one party without the other's consent where they see ongoing control. They do train their staff around financial abuse. They do recognise coerced debt. So, to Hannah's point, one of the things that I found when I moved into this space was that my passion for the work came from the sense of injustice that I felt for victims and survivors. To Hannah's point, decades later, still paying debt back, still having damaged credit ratings. It was just wrong because the quality of life, their ability to meet or realise their potential had been absolutely compromised. And so banks now actually recognise the term coerced debt. A lot of them will actually write off survivors' debts so that they don't have to spend, months paying that money back. They don't have to have that monthly reminder every time that payment is taken out of their bank account of what happened to them. It does give them an opportunity to start afresh. So as I said, we've still got a long way to go. But again, the fact that we're having that conversation, HSBC, a global brand, which I'm sure lots of people will recognise, actually launched a public awareness campaign around this. So